Frank Matzert, CEO of TradeMark East Africa, thank you so much for today's Mindspeak. What were your impressions?
Well, I think I really enjoyed it a lot, and I really thank you for inviting me, Ali.
Pleasure.
I think the range of questions was bigger than I thought.
Yes.
And actually the quality of the questions was really good. Some quite challenging questions there. And also technically some quite tricky questions by Twitter.
Yes.
from a good friend across the region.
Yes.
But I think it's been a great experience, very interesting, and I really enjoyed it a lot. I think it was also interesting to engage with an audience that I'm not used to engaging with, which is kind of really young, up and coming entrepreneurs, and I think it's really interesting, the quality and also the range of questions they asked, which of course I think are probably related to the way that they're looking at the subject matter.
And what I found interesting was when you asked for a show of hands about optimists and pessimists, there was just one pessimist in the entire audience.
Indeed. I think that's right, and it probably a reflection of the age group, I guess, a bit. But I think there is a lot of optimism about the region's potential.
Frank, you touched on so many interesting subjects, and if I might just go back to start off with TradeMark itself.
Oh yes, okay.
How many years? I remember 2010, I think you were made the CEO. Was that when TradeMark was actually set up?
Well, what happened was quite a long journey for me, because I used to work for DFID before, and I started work here back in 2006, and essentially did some initial work thinking about why these countries wanted to come together. And we produced that in 2007, and then started working with the EAC, and we really defined the trademark idea back in 2008, and then began to market it in 2009, set it up legally that year, and then away it went. So there was a lot of preparation work that went up into it. So it's had a relatively long gestation period, and also you want something like a trademark approach to be very based on practice. And we did a lot of at that time, we looked at what hasn't worked, what could work, and talked to literally hundreds of people in the design of it. So, for me, it's really fantastic to have seen that vision really from nothing to where it is now.
Yes.
It's been very satisfying.
And it's now a central player in the region.
Well, I think it's certainly, what we try to do is we try to get behind partners. So we see our role as being a facilitator. The kind of whole regional integration agenda is really driven by the heads of state, by SG Sesabera. Our job at TradeMark is to give a bit of petrol, a bit of oil, if it was a truck, if you think about it like that analogy, and maybe a map, when they get into tricky territory. But it's not to drive it. And I think we've really tried our best to get behind partners. And that's been quite an important ethos.
That's quite a sensitive thing to play at as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to put people off.
That's it. And I think initially there was a bit of suspicion as what is this trademark thing, because no one had ever tried something like that before, which is a special purpose vehicle, particularly focusing on one challenge of trade costs. So it took a bit of time, but I think I'm really pleased, because we actually hear now heads of state saying we really like this trademark thing. It's more responsive. It's doing the job. So that gives me a lot of satisfaction. But it's also important to see the results coming through. And I think I said earlier that. For us, at an aggregate level, we're really on target to do much better than we projected, and I'm really pleased about that.
And what have been your greatest successes?
Well, I think a lot of people asked me today about Burundi, and I think particularly
they were all taken by that.
Yeah, no, it's quite an interesting story, Burundi, and Burundi's been a country that struggled coming out of civil war, and has now really got on its feet, but the institutions of state were quite, they were quite undermined. So really what we tried to do was to get behind building a revenue authority, which every other country in East Africa has. In fact, Rwanda's, huge progress since the genocide was based on the Rwanda Revenue Authority.
Yes.
If you ask Kagame what the biggest reform for him was, it was that.
The ability to collect.
Yes, because that creates a level of independence and the state begins to function. So really, I think we're really proud because we got behind that process, legally first with the laws, and then secondly with the institution building phase, and now with the upgrading, the institutions come a long, long way. In fact, it's been a faster reform than in Rwanda, which many people don't know. We had a great Commissioner General who was an expatriate. Actually, pretty much every revenue authority had an expatriate at the beginning. Burundi adopted that model. Now there's really good Burundian leadership, and I think the story tells itself. We've seen a doubling, more than doubling now. I think about 150% increase in revenues. And that's getting on now, I think, for $400 million. We invested so far 20.
Yes.
That's a pretty good level of return.
That's a huge return.
Yeah, so we followed the money, and I think I said here today, that's allowed from Burundian tax generation, 40,000 people a month to get access to health that didn't before. So, you know, that's to health services. And I think that's a really big transformation, actually. That sort of ability to get behind and let those partners really run with that kind of development. So we're proud of that kind of reform. But I think a lot of the work that we've been doing on simplifying trade and some of the electronic systems have been quite transformational. But for example, the electronic cargo tracking in Uganda, the Rwanda single window, we're hoping to do a good replacement to Simba here in Kenya, which we hope will make a big difference.
Looking at, at the community, take Mombasa. Mombasa still seems to be the main entry point and exit point for our goods. Is that going to remain the case? I mean, there are lots of other projects. The Chinese were making a big commitment in Tanzania. How do you see, what does this community look like?
Yeah, well, I think the ports are essential. And I mean, the reason I didn't talk about the ports is yet because, our programs are younger there. But there's been a lot of success. I'm really proud that His Excellency President Kenyatta signed that port charter. I thought that was a really big step in the right direction. And, shows his great leadership, really. But there's a kind of software, hardware issue with ports. There's how productive are they and what their capacity is. And, I think what I tried to show today is trade growth is going to be high. So you need to invest in increased capacity, but you also need to actually operate it more productively. And if you think about it, it's like an equilibrium. The more productive you are, the less capacity you need. The less productive you are, the more capacity you need. So that equilibrium is something that we play with. But what's the potential for Mombasa is what you asked me. I think Mombasa is a very important port. It's the biggest in East Africa. It's double the size of Dar es Salaam. And the hinterland, Mombasa is truly what we call a corridor port, because I think around 70% of the cargo, or 80% actually, is actually not for Mombasa. So while in Dar es Salaam, 80%, 90% is for Dar es Salaam. So it's a very different port. And I think that that's important. The transshipment market is greater. Most of it does come to Nairobi, though. I think around 60%. And then Kampala is the biggest, and then Kigali is South Sudan. So it's a very different type of port. And because of its natural physical location on the northern corridor, which is where a lot of consumers are, it will continue to play that role for a very long time to come. So a very strategic asset for Kenya, and getting it right will affect millions of lives. So that's why we've now got, I think, around an $80 million program there, one of our biggest projects. But Dar es Salaam is also important. I was just in Dar this last week. Again, we're scaling up our program there. And with the World Bank, we're really proud. We're going to be putting in 60 million. The World Bank will put in 600. That's a kind of leverage ratio that we want to get. And on Mombasa, we're actually going to be holding an investors conference for more investment there. So the ports are critical. I personally think when you look at trade on the central corridor, which Dar really supports, Dar Port, there's room for another container, another port. And Bagamoyo is where the Chinese, I think you hinted at, have committed. And they're going to be putting in, I think, about 1.5 billion to develop the site. So because of Dar, it's physical, I don't know if you've been there, but the physical dimensions of the port are very constrained. So you really need to do a lot of efficiency. There's really not much room to increase the capacity. So another port's needed on the coast. And Bagamoyo is not a bad place because the ancillary infrastructure is pretty good. And then, of course, Mtwara is developing quickly as a kind of gas port. And then there's a potential for Lamu, which I think is early days yet, but the potential there to link up. Yep, and also with South Sudan for the oil. I mean, essentially the first project there could easily be an oil pipeline and offshore platform there. So, I don't think it's about any one port. It's about actually making the region's trade facilitated by ports, because ports are so important. And I tried to show today, actually, they're the biggest source of time and cost delays
I saw that.
along the whole corridors.
Yeah. The cost component seemed to be the biggest issue there.
So, exactly. So, and I think progress is being made. So now you can understand why we were so keen to get this port charter here moving, because a lot of it is the moving parts are complex. And operating a good port really is complicated because there's so many agencies. Someone said to me once, inefficiency at ports is like death by 1,000 cuts. It's little, small things that aggregate big time. So getting a kind of agreement amongst the port community is actually a really big step forward.
Yes.
And I remember when we launched it in Mombasa back in June, people came up and said, oh, we never thought this day would happen. So, I think, leadership is really taking this on board. Our leaders and our presidents, I think, are really beginning to see that actually this is going to be the stuff that will create the jobs. And that was a big theme of today, I thought, was that job creation challenge.
Yes, and do you feel confident? I mean, I was thinking everyone talks about it as the demographic dividend, this huge demographic dividend from all these young people. But the challenge is it could be a demographic time bomb if
I think
don't get jobs.
Absolutely. I mean, every coin has another side, and I think it is a dividend, but it's also a huge time bomb.
Yeah.
And I think if we don't create the jobs, actually that could be a real challenge. And I think that our political leaders are saying that.
Yes.
So we really need to invest in ways the private sector can create those jobs. But I think what was also interesting was that issue about skills and and just how long it takes to get a job.
Well, I was shocked, and I think everybody was shocked on social media as well. That's a scary number.
It is, and I think, I remember the statistic a few years ago, I'm probably out of date, but I think it used to be 800,000 people coming onto the job market each year, with 80,000 jobs in the private sector being created. Now, I mean, that really is the challenge that we should be taking very seriously. And I've certainly read in labour market statistics that it can take between 7 and 9 years to get that job. So, for somebody with a low skills base, that's a big challenge. So self-employment is the only route for most folks. And actually, that isn't easy. And, the kind of barriers within the financial sector, better than me. But if you're an informal business or somebody without any collateral, it's not easy to really get access to finance.
There's more product coming down there, actually.
Right.
It's interestingly enough, because people see it as an opportunity as well, I think, post with the mobile phone revolution.
That's true. And I know that Equity Bank, there's been a lot more financial sector inclusion at that level. But I think that's going to be the challenge, really.
Frank, you've been here how many years in East Africa?
Been here 8 years now, Really enjoyed it.
You were saying there's been quite a transformation. How would you describe it now? What has that transformation been, and where is it going directionally?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, confidence.
Yes.
I mean, I think confidence has changed a lot, hasn't it? And investment. There's a lot more investment coming into Africa. And how many private equity funds did we have 8 years ago?
Yes.
Almost none. How many do we have?
Yes.
Oh, a lot now.
Yeah.
So I think that there's, and you may argue that that's due to quantitative easing if you want to get technical, but that liquidity's found its way to Africa. And so I think, that investment, the capital's there. I think there's been a lot of progress on the regional front. I mean, I think I said to you, thanks to the EAC and some of the work that we're doing and many others, times to trade from getting a container from Mombasa to Kampala, it's come down from, I think, around 18, 20 days to now 6. Now that's a big transformation. So I see a lot of changes there. The leadership, I think, is much more behind this. People see that infrastructure is a key challenge. In the old days, people used to kind of grin and bear it.
Yes.
Now people say, and actually, there are plans now on the agenda there. I think the other big thing I see is that the private sector's just really, burgeoned. There's been a lot of growth, and it's been in sectors that, a lot of people in Europe don't recognize. Retail, real estate, consumption, telecoms, services. So, that I think has been a really big change.
It hasn't really been an extractive story, which is interesting.
Which is interesting, because that's always the way it's painted, isn't it? Which I think is quite wrong. And then I think physically Nairobi's changed. I mean, it used to be that you would get around very easily.
Yes.
The economic growth has negative effects in terms of traffic flows have been really slowed down. But then again, now we see all the new highways, and now, I mean, just think about the physical change to get to Karen from CBD and even to get to Westlands, the other part of the city, and other parts. We've seen bypasses come in. Physically, that's changed a lot. And every street corner in Nairobi has changed, hasn't it? And when I think about where my office is, there are 10 high-rises that weren't there 4 or 5 years ago. So I think on many fronts it's changed, and confidence I feel is, it's something to be proud of, the way that things have moved forward. So I don't know. I think it's really been a bit of a renaissance, really. Now, I mean, the big challenge is, can we sustain it?
Yes.
And I think,
what's the biggest risk to all this?
well, I know it sounds all a bit academic, but I think actually the resilience of institutions, and I don't mean the kind of bricks and mortar buildings, a regulator or whatever, but really the rules of the game that markets operate by. Really, how resilient are they? And how adaptable and how much can they be reformed? I think that's the challenge, because we're up against the rest of the world. It's got to be really good. And I think that, to me, is the real challenge. We need institutions that are not just okay, but are really good. And they continue to adapt and give us the competitiveness we need as a region. Because, without those institutions underpinning it, this could be a growth spurt that could finish. Yeah. And I think, that's probably, to me, the biggest thing. But then also the political commitment to really seeing some of these things happen. And, I think some of the other things that we talked about, the infrastructure and so forth. So I think particularly I'm interested to explore that. We'll be thinking that through what we do, and we'll try to help the region realize that growth over the next 5 years. So, I'm really hoping that the TradeMark program and what we're trying to do is actually really helps that happen. That's what we really want to do, is make it a very practical partner to realize the prosperity through trade.
Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay.